Thank you, Trevor. Good evening, everybody. Trevor's comment about my appearance might tell a story about who takes the brunt of the pressure in our home, who bears all the stress, but we'll not get into that this evening. Well, this is the first of 3 evenings that we have on the whole subject of life issues. And the topics that have been chosen are some of these big issues of life that really raise for us some of the most important questions that we can ever ask ourselves. Life is full of pressures, isn't it? The boss gives you unrealistic targets at work. The family give you piles of washing and ironing. Other people give you grief and headaches. And then sometimes the really big things happen, don't they? The big life changes. And then at other times, it's the wee things, isn't it? Just the build-up of those everyday things piling up that can get us stressed out. Well, this evening we want to look a little bit at what stress is. We want to ask what causes stress, where does it come from? And then, of course, the big question is, well, how do we cope whenever life gets too much and the pressure builds up? Let's look then, first of all, this evening at what stress is. Really, stress is the effect on us when the demands get too much. When the pressures, when the demands of a situation are greater than our ability to cope with them. Now, whenever that happens, then it prevents us from reaching our goals. You start off in your day, you've got your idea of what you want to get done, you've got your goals there, but then other things come in as a kind of a threat, and the demands pile up and they get too much, and of course then we can't reach those goals that we have set for ourselves. And whenever that threat comes in and we can't reach our goals, we feel stress. But what's going on in our bodies? Why does stress feel the way that it feels inside? Why do we get those various symptoms, which we'll go on to look at in a moment or two? Why do we feel the way that we feel whenever we're stressed? How does the body respond? Well, basically, what happens in that situation when the pressures build up and the demands get too much, the nervous system and the hormonal system, they kind of kick into gear. And the body gets itself ready for action. In other words, it perceives that there's a threat, there's something there that needs to be dealt with, and the body kicks into action. What happens then is that it starts to release these hormones around the body, things you'll have heard of, things like adrenaline, that get the body going. We call them stress hormones. And we get this situation, first of all, called an alarm reaction. Okay? So, the adrenaline's flowing around the body, the blood sugar level increases so that there's more energy available to the body. The heart rate is increasing. You know what it's like whenever you're feeling under stress. What happens? The heart begins to thump, doesn't it? The blood flow then to your muscles increases so that your performance is better. Believe it or not, even your pupils dilate so that you can kind of see more around you. And the blood supply to the brain increases so that you're thinking more clearly and you're more alert. And what's happening overall is that your body is getting itself ready for action. Remember what's happened? Things are piling up. There's a threat in the way. The body has to get itself ready for action. You may well have heard of the fight, flight, or fright response. And that's what's going on there. Whenever there's a fright, if you're walking home tonight and some big monster jumps out from behind a hedge and you get a fright, well, that's what's going to happen. The body gets itself ready for action. The adrenaline starts to flow around and you get all of those changes. Or whenever you have to get ready for a fight, again, the threat is there. The body's getting ready for action. Or if that monster jumps out and you're having to turn your heel and run the other direction. Again, when you're taking flight, again, it's the same changes. The body getting ready to meet demands. Now, it's important to remember that, as we'll see in a moment. Well, after that initial kind of alarm, the body begins to cope. The adrenaline levels begin to reduce. They sort of go up immediately and then they begin to reduce down. And if the stress goes away, then everything returns to normal. But if the stress doesn't go away, then there are other changes in the body. What happens is that one of the glands in the body releases some steroids, and they take over to try and keep up the energy levels and to try and keep the blood sugar up. And we call that stage resistance. If the stress still doesn't go away, then what begins to happen is that the body's resources begin to get depleted. The blood sugar begins to fall, fat stores begin to get used up, and we enter this phase that we call exhaustion. The exhaustion phase. The body is getting depleted of its resources. And it's then that we're prone to getting illnesses, and that's why under chronic stress, then sometimes people begin to notice that they're more prone to things like the blood pressure going up, and things like heart disease and stomach ulcers and asthma, even conditions like that, which are sometimes associated with chronic stress. So these are some of the conditions, some of the phases that happen in our bodies whenever stress comes along, whenever the demands get too much. Now we can look at this a little bit further with this graph. Now don't panic, please, okay? It's not too complicated, really. I don't think we do have a... Oh, here we go. We've got a little light here. There's the right play with lasers, okay? Now along this side of the graph, we have what's called the demand. Okay, in other words, this is the demand of a situation. Down at this end, we have what is low demand. Okay, at that end of the graph, that's when you're on holiday. You know, you're on the beach, sun's shining, water's lapping gently at your feet. You know, you can see some of you beginning to nod off there. Okay, that's what happens at this end of the graph. And as we increase along here, then the demand or the pressure increases as well. In the middle here, you've got sort of Monday morning feeling here, the demand increasing, or a kind of a 2-week pile of ironing for those mums at home. That's that kind of demand increasing. Now, over at this end of the graph, then you've got really high demand situations. That's when you're going for a job interview. That's when there's a 4-week pile of ironing. 3 of your 4 children have got measles and your mother-in-law is coming for tea the next evening. You know, that's that kind of high pressure, high demand situation. Along this side of the graph, we have what's called the performance. In other words, that's how well we're functioning, our ability to do things, to cope with things. And it could be your performance in anything. It could be doing the housework, doing your job, revising for exams, answering phones, working on a production line, anything like that. And of course then your performance increases along this line. Now this graph is very important because it helps us understand what's happening in stress. You'll see then that with this graph, whenever the demand is low, the performance is low as well. Okay, we sometimes call this the drone zone. Okay, not my creation, that one, the drone zone. So not much demand, not much useful performance either. This is sort of the couch potato part of the graph here, where someone hasn't really got an awful lot of demand in their life. There isn't much challenge or stimulation. Someone maybe in a job for which they're overqualified. Let's take an example. Let's take Tony, who's a plumber. I should have had a disclaimer at this point. This isn't a real person, okay? This is just somebody that's made up. Tony, who's a plumber, and he's starting out. It's the middle of the housing boom. A few years ago, he's in a job at a big firm, and he's put in a role where he doesn't have an awful lot to do. He's a plumber's mate, and he's just asked to make the tea, help out a little bit. Tony, a qualified plumber, he's in a job where there isn't enough demand, there isn't enough stimulation. and he gets bored. Finds himself getting lethargic and sluggish and unhappy and discontent. There's understimulation. And that's why we say things like, I'm out of my mind with boredom. Okay? Whenever we're in a situation where there isn't enough demand, actually it can be quite stressful, and our performance isn't that great. What then we see is that as the demand increases, the performance increases also. And we move into this phase here called healthy tension. In other words, we need a little demand in our lives to be able to get some useful performance. In other words, we need a little bit of challenge every day in our lives to help us to get going, to work, and to function, and to keep us on our toes. It's part of how we've been made, part of the design, part of how God has created us. In other words, some stress is normal. Okay, it's a normal physiological response in the body, and it's there to help us. And at that point in the graph, there's just enough tension to get us focused, to have energy, to have concentration. Remember what we said at the beginning, that alarm phase where everything's getting going and the body's getting ready for action. Well, that's good. It's healthy because there are situations in which we need that. So let's come back to Tony. Remember our plumber? Tony's boss sees that he's good at his job, he's faithful, he's dependable, and so he gives him more responsibility. And so Tony's getting a few jobs to do on his own, some new stuff, just enough challenge to keep him going. And he's in this kind of healthy tension phase. He finds his performance going up. Sometimes it gets a wee bit much, but then he kind of comes back again, and it's just a nice, healthy level of tension. When he gets home in the evening, he's able to wind down and relax and be able to, things aren't as stressful then. The demand is increased, but Tony is well able for the task, and he's enjoying it, getting a degree of satisfaction from his job. And the message here is that some stress is good. Some stress is good. But we need to be careful, because as the demand increases further, look at what happens our functioning. It begins to go down. We begin to move out of the healthy zone. Our performance begins to decline, and in this zone we begin to see changes. We see changes in how we feel. We notice changes in our bodies, and other people will see changes in us as well. In this kind of zone here, this sort of fatigue zone, someone begins to get irritable. Their sleep becomes disturbed. Their concentration goes off and they don't focus as well. And they begin to feel tired all the time. They get a fatigue. And this begins to settle in. In this kind of phase, people may use caffeine and other stimulants to try and keep themselves going, things like tea and Coke and other drinks. But of course, taking too much of those kind of stimulants will reduce your sleep, and then you get into this cycle of reduced sleep and making yourself more tired, then taking more caffeine to try and keep going. This stage 2, people often use alcohol to try and calm their nerves and overcome sleep problems, but again, this can end up causing a vicious circle, causing more harm than good. These are all warning signs. These are warning signs that something is up and that we need to take notice. And what it's warning us about is the need for rest. And yet, very often, what do you think people do? They think, well, if only I can work a bit harder, I'll feel on top of things, and then it'll all get better. We push ourselves harder, and we begin to ignore the warning signs. And in fact, ignoring those warning signs is a symptom itself of the stress. We realize there's something wrong, but we begin to think, well, if only I can just try and get on top of things a little bit more, it'll all be better. So let's come back to Tony again. Tony decides then that things are going well in the firm, and he decides to go out on his own. Remember, middle of the housing boom, plenty of work out there, and he wants to get his business up and running, so he takes on everything that comes his way. Now, it's not long then before Tony is feeling a bit overwhelmed. He's getting jobs left, right, and centre. He's working long hours. He's doing homers most nights. His wife is noticing that he's going a bit hard at it. She tells him to slow down. But what does Tony do? He thinks to himself, well, if I can just work a little bit hard and a little bit longer, I'll get on top of it and things will get better. But of course, all that tends to do is to drive things further down this side of the graph. And if the stress continues, then it becomes more chronic. What we find is that whenever we're kind of hovering about here, if we do rest up and slow down, we can come back over and begin to recover again. But sometimes if we keep pushing ourselves too far, we go down into this zone here, which is really a zone leading into panic, feelings, and ill health. At that stage, the effect of the stress, and remember we're getting into that kind of resistance and exhaustion stage that we mentioned at the beginning, the effect of stress then is leading to physical problems. We mentioned blood pressure changes, heart disease, stomach ulcers, irritable bowel, chronic fatigue, the kind of conditions that we're all fairly well familiar with. And there's also evidence that stress can also affect the immune system. That's why people often are prone to infections. Very often students, at exam times, they tend to get colds and things like that. It's this stress building up and its effect on the immune system. So Tony, then, our plumber, he notices then that there are these increasing feelings of nervousness. Remember, he's trying to keep all the plates spinning, trying to keep on top of things. The demand's getting too much, but he's trying to get on top of it. And at times he's noticing panic. He's maybe driving to work and he feels breathless, and there are palpitations, the heart's thumping, the chest is heavy and tight, there are butterflies in the stomach, his mouth is dry, he feels all tensed up. There's worry, there's distraction about all of the things that he's going to have to try and get done that day. And Tony has this increasing sense that things are getting out of control. Tony's heading into this zone of ill health and panic. And then, of course, it can move further on. If he doesn't let up, it moves further on down into the stage which we call burnout or breakdown. Tony is struggling to keep going. He's getting up in the morning and he's reluctant to go to work. He's feeling just exhausted and washed out all of the time. And sometimes at this stage, actually, people begin to develop symptoms of depression, low mood, again, sleep disturbed, the appetite goes, there may be weight loss, and thoughts and feelings of hopelessness, and even self-harm or suicide. Tony notices too that his work is deteriorating. He's not concentrating as well. His performance is going right down. People are commenting that the work isn't up to his usual standard. And he's noticing too that it's not just in the work situation, it's spreading right out over other areas of his life, including his relationships with others. Let's look a little bit more closely at this burnout stage. One way of thinking about burnout is of a kind of an emotional exhaustion. It's whenever just emotionally we're drained, we're at the end of ourselves, we're exhausted. And there's a build-up of all of those symptoms that we've mentioned. The individual realizes that they're just not getting things done. They're not on top of things at all. For some, they're increasingly absent from work. There's a high sickness rate often at this stage. Maybe in the home, you're just not able to keep on top of all of the various household tasks. There are other changes as well. Sometimes at this burnout stage, people can become very cynical about others. If it's a work-related stress, they can become very cynical about the organization that they work for. They begin to find fault in other people and in other members and colleagues in the organization. And of course, what's that kind of person like to work with? The kind of person who's always finding fault and cynical and complaining and grumbling, well, they're difficult, aren't they? And you're working with someone like that and you perceive them as difficult. They're always negative. They're always criticizing other people. Very often what's behind that is that the person's just really stressed out and at this kind of burnout stage with stress. And then sometimes people describe a breakdown, a point in time when they just feel that they can't continue. Tony maybe arrives home just one evening and he sits down at the table with his wife and he's just in tears and he can hardly speak and he just feels he can't go on any longer. That's this burnout stage. Well, we're trying to look at what stress is, trying to answer this question. We've seen that stress is what happens when the demands get too much and we're not able to reach the goals that we set for ourselves. And we've looked at some of the effects on our bodies and how stress and performance work together. Just at this point, some points I want you to remember. Some stress is good. Some stress is good. Remember what we said, a certain amount of stress is healthy. Too much stress, though, is bad. And don't ignore those warning signs when they come. And thirdly, if you see them, take action. The answer then is rest if you see those warning signs. Well, that's what stress is. Let's take a few minutes then to look at what causes stress. What are some of the things that can cause this kind of situation in life? Remember what we've said already, stress is what happens. You'll be saying this in your sleep tonight. Stress is what happens whenever the demands of a situation get too much. They're greater than our ability to cope with them. So we have our to-do list for the day, and the increasing demands of other things come in and prevent us from reaching our goals. And again, it can often happen, can't it, in everyday life? Those snags, those hitches come in, those little unexpected things just pop into your agenda. What you had planned doesn't work out, and things just creep in, and it all gets to you, and it causes stress. So it happens just in everyday life, and the demands are greater than our abilities. Stress, though, secondly, there is also caused by some of the bigger life changes that come our way. Stress is created by events that require change, and that can be change for both the better and for the worse. Now, it's obvious, isn't it, that negative changes in life will have negative effects. There are people out there who measure these things, and one of the scales that looks at the different life events that can cause stress, here are the top 6. Number 1, death of a spouse. Obviously, we can see how a lot of the change there in terms of role and relationship, coupled with the grief, is going to be very stressful. Divorce, number 2. Number 3, marital separation. Number 4, a jail term, obviously quite stressful. Number 5, then death of a close family member. And then number 6, personal injury or illness. Okay, fairly obvious. A lot of those major life changes are going to be stressful. And they're negative. Those are things that we don't want to happen. But weighing in at number 7 is marriage. Okay, see some people smiling there thinking, yes, I can understand that. Another one is job promotion. Why is it then that seemingly these positive events in life can cause stress? I mean, job promotion, new challenge, increased income, how come it's stressful? Again, because even positive things in our life require change. Remember what we said at the beginning. We have certain goals that we set for ourselves, and whenever a threat comes in to prevent us reaching them, we feel stressed. And marriage, for example, can do just that. Two people come together, they have their own idea, their own agenda of what marriage is going to be like. They have their own goals, if you like, but then whenever they come together, it all has to change. And in a sense, there's a threat to your own goals and what you want to do and what you want to get done and what you want to get out of life. And that kind of change, that kind of threat, if you like, can be stressful. And that's why even sometimes some of the positive events in life we can find stressful. So major life events then can be a major cause of stress. Personality, I've mentioned there. There are some people that are more prone to stress than others. There are some people for whom that curve that we had a few slides back, there are some people for whom, in a sense, their curve will be kind of down here. Okay? In other words, it won't just take as much demand or as much pressure to bring on the symptoms of stress for them. And of course, there are some other superheroes who have curves a bit like that, okay? And they can seem to cope with lots and lots of stuff and be able to manage it. Again, part of our personality, part of our temperament, part, I think, of how we've been created individually. So our personality can contribute to stress. Another one there, and again, it maybe goes almost without saying, is conflict in relationships. But it's recognized out there as a major cause of stress for us. You know what it's like with someone with whom you have a tension or an atmosphere, or where there have been arguments or hostility, a home where maybe a family, a home where there's a lot of arguments and hostility, or even where there's that more kind of cool, distant kind of atmosphere in the home, and we're not sure how to resolve it. Well, all of that can cause stress. The demand can be too much for us, and it can cause the changes that we've mentioned before. So these are some of the causes then of stress. Well, how do we deal with it all? What can we do to cope with stress? How do we manage stress? We've said already then again that stress is what occurs when the demands of a situation are greater than our ability to cope with them. Now, what I want you to do just now as we come to look at this section of the talk this evening is I want you to think about some stressful situation that you're facing. Okay, I want you to think about something that kind of, brings on some of those symptoms that we talked about earlier for you. And as we talk then through how we manage stress, I want you to kind of try to think through in your own mind then how it would apply to the situation that you're facing. Broadly speaking, there are two things that we can do in terms of managing stress, okay? We can either deal with the situation and try to reduce the demands of the situation, or we can deal with ourselves, all right? That's me very often. And we can try to increase our ability to cope. So we can try to reduce the demands or increase our ability to cope. Very often it depends where we are on the curve here. Very often we can make changes if we're just sort of over at this stage of the stress response curve. Changes will very often then bring us back over to here. Whenever we're down here, very often the answer really is complete rest, a complete break from whatever is causing the stress. So very often it depends where you are on this curve as to what will work. So I'm going to look at it in terms of 10 questions. I think there's a book out there. I always think I should try and remember the name of it when I do this, but it's something like the 7 rules for highly effective people or highly amazing people. Somebody's got it there. Well, here's 10 questions for highly stressed people, okay? 10 questions that we can ask ourselves to help us to manage stress. Here, the first group of questions are to do with reducing the demands of a situation. First question is this: what needs to change? Okay, it seems fairly simple, doesn't it? But it's very, very important. What needs to change? And here, we're trying to identify the source of the stress. In other words, does work need to change? No point, for example, in Tony, if he comes out of work, to go straight back into that situation with all of these huge demands facing him. We need to identify the source. Or maybe it's home life. Maybe home is stressful. Does a husband need to change? Does a wife need to change? Do some responsibilities or commitments need to be dropped? And of course, all of that can be easier said than done. We'll look at again in a moment or two at how we can do that. Certainly, if there's been work-related stress, the advice would be that you don't return straight back into the situation that you left, and that some changes must be made before you return to work. So what needs to change? And whenever we identify what needs to be changed, well then, how do we change it? Here are some simple steps then which can help us to look at how we change something, help us to think this through a little. This is how to solve problems. Again, first of all, we've got to identify the problem. So say now Tony has come out of work. Okay, so he's not at work any longer, he's not earning anything. There are bills coming in, there's a mortgage payment going out, and with Tony then there's a mounting level of debt. So Tony has to then choose one issue to deal with. He could look at the whole work situation, but that's not really that relevant to him at the minute. What seems to be more relevant to him is this issue of debt. So he's identified then the problem at the minute that's causing him some stress. Secondly then, he needs to brainstorm solutions. And the key here is to be very broad about the kind of solutions you're looking for. So let's take Tony's problem of debt, for example. He could borrow. He could go to the bank, building society, try to borrow some money. He could return to work, but that's not very realistic perhaps at the minute. He could rob a bank. Okay, we did say he had to be broad, all right. He could rob a bank. He could budget and he could organize repayments. That would be another option. So he has to brainstorm the solutions and be as broad as possible. Thirdly then, he needs to take each solution and weigh up the pros and cons. And of course, there may need to be someone alongside him helping him do all of this if he's not quite able to concentrate and work through it all himself. Well, he could return to work. That would help, but he isn't really able for that. He could borrow, maybe a short-term solution, but of course then he has to pay back what he's borrowed. He could budget and repay. It's not an immediate fix, but it would be a start to try and get some small repayments made. Fourthly, then, he has to choose the best option. And the best option is the option that's most realistic and the option that's most doable. Fifthly, and this is the bit that very often people forget to do, they're so relieved that they've found a solution to the problem of their stress that they then forget to put it into practice. And so Tony then has to sit down and work out the steps as to how he might then put this into practice. So for example, he decides, along with his wife, they weigh it all up, they decide not to rob the bank, and they decide they'll go for the budget and repayment option. So they work out the steps. Does he need help to be able to do all of this? How does he budget for the business and for the home? He needs to get together some kind of repayment scheme and so on. He works out the steps, step by step, how he's going to budget and repay. So he puts it then into practice. And then, importantly too, he has to review it. If it all goes wrong, it all goes pear-shaped, he doesn't just give up, he goes back and he reviews it to see what went wrong. Okay, problem solving. Remember, we're looking at how to reduce the demands of a situation, and we ask this question, well, what needs to change? What needs to change? We've looked at some steps for changing that. The second very important question is, have I prioritized? Have I prioritized? This is particularly useful if the stressful situation involves too much to do. So you housewives out there, who are just thinking about going home this evening, this pile of work that has to be done, where do you start? Well, this is where prioritization comes in, when we feel overwhelmed by a situation. This is a picture of my secretary at the hospital on a typical day. This is a lady who needs to prioritize, I think. Okay, where do we start then with prioritization? Well, we make a list of what needs to be done. Whenever you've got this huge list of tasks, you hardly know where to start, then we try to make a list then of everything that needs to be done. Very often, actually, getting it down on paper can help tremendously. Sometimes it's whenever your mind is just full of all of this stuff that needs to be done, it can just feel so overwhelming. Even sometimes the very act of getting it down on paper in front of you can help to make it feel more manageable, more under control. So we make a list of what needs to be done. Secondly, then, we need to ask, what's urgent? What's urgent? Urgent things are things that require immediate attention. Things that need to be done quickly, things that need to be done to a deadline. What's urgent? And the next question then that we ask is, what's important? What's important? What matters a lot? What's significant? It may not be urgent, it may not need to be done immediately, but it is important. For example, if I don't fix that wall sometime, then the house will fall down. Okay? It's important, but it may not be urgent. So what's urgent and what's important? What some people find useful then is drawing out a kind of a table here of importance versus urgency. Okay? Things that are urgent, things that are non-urgent, things that are important, things that are less important. And of course, what's a priority is what comes in this little box here. Things that are both urgent, they need done quickly, and they're important, they matter a lot. Now that can be very useful, as I say, whenever we're snowed under with tasks. The plumber, Tony, whenever he's getting all of these demands coming in at him, all of these jobs, left, right, and centre, he needs to prioritize. He needs to look at what's urgent and what's important. Again, the housewife who's inundated with work at home. Prioritizing really does help us. It can help to bring a sense of control to a situation that can just seem overwhelming and out of control. Importantly also, it can help us to learn to say no. Something that a lot of us are not very good at. Saying no is a tremendous skill to learn. It can fend off all kinds of extra pressures. It can help to reduce the demands and the pressure significantly. And yet we find it difficult, don't we? We find it very, very difficult often to say no. Why? Why do we find it difficult? Why did Tony not like to say no to all of those people who needed a dripping tap fixed? Well, perhaps he was wanting to get the business and get the business up and running. But very often it's things like, well, we don't like to disappoint people. We feel the need to help others. Sometimes really underneath all of that, if we're honest with ourselves, it can be a bit of pride. We like people to think well of us, and we don't like to refuse them and to say no. But prioritizing can help us to do that, because whenever we've prioritized, we know what's urgent, we know what's important, and if someone else comes in with another demand that isn't either urgent or important, well then it's a lot easier, isn't it, to be able to say no to them. So prioritizing is a very useful skill to learn. So remember, we're trying to learn how to manage stress here. We're looking first of all at how we reduce the demands of a situation. We've asked what needs to change. We've looked at how we prioritize. The third thing we need to ask then is, am I managing my time? Am I managing my time? Time management, again, is a very useful skill to have. How do we manage time? Well, again, quite simply, we get a big diary or a big planner or a big sheet of paper, and we begin to plan ahead. We begin to organize the things that we have to do. Sorry, I'll go back there. We've already prioritized. Remember, you've got your big list of tasks now. They're prioritized. You know what's important. You know what's urgent. And what you want to do now is to timetable those out. Okay? You look at your day, you look at your week, and you look at what you have to get done. And then you try to put the tasks into time slots in that week. Now, it's important to allow enough time for each task. It's important to think realistically about how much time each task needs. It's important as well to timetable in periods where possible for rest and for a break, if it's possible. Some of you will have schedules and demands. I remember one time my wife heard someone say this, about timetabling in rest periods. She thought, what? Rest periods in the day? I would love a rest period in the day. It just wasn't really realistic in her situation. And again, you have to be realistic here, but where possible, try to timetable in those periods where you can get a rest and maybe have someone else come in to shore up the demands. Make sure the goals that you set are achievable. No sense in trying to timetable in too much. And it's one of the greatest mistakes that we make in trying to manage time. We try to fit in too much. We're so excited. We've got all this time. We've got this list of tasks. And we try to get them all in. And of course, what we do is we squeeze in so much that's just totally unrealistic. And halfway through the day, we feel totally defeated and deflated because we haven't got anywhere near done what we had planned to do. We've got to be realistic about what we can manage, and then be disciplined. Be focused on the goals that you've set for yourself. There's a very useful thing in managing time which is called compartmentalization. Okay? Compartments, okay? Compartmentalization. And the idea there is that if you set aside a period of time to get a task done, then stick with that time. So if you've set, say, between 10 and 11 to get the task done, then stick to that time. At 11 o'clock, if you haven't got it finished, then leave it, okay, and go on to the next thing that you had planned to do. Because what happens very often is that we get to 11 o'clock and we think, oh, right, I've just got a little bit more to do here. I'll just try and get that done. And we work over the time, and then we try to work harder to get the next one done in time, the next task done. What's happening? We're building up the stress again, aren't we? And the tasks begin to accumulate. So let things stay in their compartments, and then what you can do is you can always leave time later in the day or later in the week to kind of tidy up the loose ends. Where there's been a run over in time and you haven't quite got something finished, leave time aside, leave a compartment of time aside later in the day or the week to be able to tidy all of that up. Be flexible about how you manage your time. Life can't always be predicted, can it? We have to be flexible. And if it all falls apart, don't give up. Review what happened, review what went wrong, go back, try again, and reset your goals and your schedule. So, am I managing my time? Fourthly then, can others help? If the demands are too much, can you delegate? Can someone else come in and help out with the tasks that need to get done, whether it's work, whether it's housework, whatever it is that needs to happen? Can someone else come in? Can someone else do it? Can you get support? The understanding and the support and the help of others can be desperately important at times of stress. So can others help? So remember, we're trying to ask these questions which help us to manage stress. This is what you'll all be like after this evening, putting all of this into practice. Okay, the second set of questions then look at increasing our ability to cope. How do we increase our ability to cope? We've looked at how we reduce the demands. How then do we increase our ability to cope? Well, the first question that we can ask there is, do I need a break? Do I need to take a rest? We've already mentioned this evening the importance of that. Sometimes a break from work can be easier said than done, but of course if there are warning signs there, then we need to take note of them and we need to take action. So taking a break is important. Let me ask you what your Sunday is like. Sunday is very often a day when most of us aren't working. It's a day in 7 that God has set aside for rest. How well are you using that day? Again, in terms of getting rest and taking a break, reducing caffeine, reducing alcohol, those will help reduce feelings of stress. So do I need a break? Should I see a doctor? I think that if you're beginning to notice some of the symptoms that we mentioned at the beginning, that it is very useful to visit your doctor and to discuss the symptoms that you have. We've already mentioned how it can lead to depression, which is something that a doctor should know about. We've seen too that there are other physical effects and physical side effects of stress. And so it's important again because some of those can be treated medically. What about medication for stress itself? Well, actually, yes, antidepressant therapy may be useful, and it's something that we'll be looking at in a bit more detail next week, especially if you're getting some of those panicky, anxious type feelings and some symptoms of depression. Again, antidepressants can be useful there. They're not the sole cure, but they can play a part in dealing with some of those physical symptoms. Another question then to ask in terms of increasing our own ability to cope when the demands get too much is, am I cut out for this? Am I cut out for the responsibilities that I'm trying to deal with? Have I the right abilities for this? Is that why I'm feeling the pressure here? Is that why the demands seem to be too much? Maybe I need some training. Maybe I need to develop some extra skills to be able to cope with what I'm dealing with. Perhaps I even need to think about a change of career. Perhaps the job, the situation I'm in is not something I'm suited for, and therefore that's why I'm feeling that the demands are too much. What I would say there, though, is that before you make any major decisions about changing your career or anything like that, that you should really wait until a lot of these symptoms have settled down, because whenever you're at the peak of stress, it colours everything so much that I think it's very, very difficult and probably not very wise to make major life decisions based on that. And you should really wait until you can get things into a better perspective before making big decisions. So increasing then our ability to cope. Finally then, the last 3 questions. And here I want us to kind of take a step back from dealing with the specifics of stress. And I want to really look at some of the deeper issues that I think a time of stress can raise for us. And the next question I want us to think about is, where do those demands come from? I've said that stress happens whenever the demands are too much. When the work piles in, where is that coming from? When the car won't start on your way to the doctor's appointment. When the baby throws up over your suit at 5 to 8 in the morning as you're rushing out the door to work. Where does all of that come from? Well, in Tony's case, we could have said that it was taking on too much. Or we could have said that it was the debt building up when he couldn't work. Or we could have said that it was the bubble bursting on the housing market, which meant then that the work was hard to come by and it was all getting too much. But ultimately, who is behind all of these things that go on in our world and that create so much pressure for us? And ultimately, the Bible tells us about a God who works all things according to a plan, a God who's wise, a God who knows what he's doing, a God who's good, and a God who knows what's best for us. And I think that a time of stress in our lives is an opportunity to try to step back and to look at life in that way and to see God in the picture. Where do the demands come from? The next question is, what does this say about my heart? Now, that's not maybe something that for most of us we really take time to think about. We're so busy firefighting, we're so busy dealing with the demands that are in our face that we often don't take time to take a step back, to try to quieten down and to ask, what is it actually saying about me? Because, of course, whenever stress comes, we do have a part to play. And we do have to ask ourselves questions like, well, what are my goals in life? If stress comes whenever there's a threat to my goals, then what are my goals in life? What is it that I am aiming for? What is it that I'm going for in life? What is it that's important to me? What do I want? Perhaps for Tony it was getting more promotion, getting more money, being able to provide for his family, getting them a holiday, getting a bigger home, being just that bit more comfortable, nothing lavish, but just something which would be nice to live in. Or perhaps it was because he wanted to be well thought of. Maybe that's what was going on in his heart. Maybe he wanted a good reputation. Maybe he wanted people to think well of him. Maybe that's what he wanted. Another way to put this question is, what is it that rules your heart? What's your priority in life? What is it that you really desire? What's your passion? A time of stress is perhaps showing you something very important about you and about your heart. What does it say about my heart? The final question is this: where can I find true rest? I think it's a really important question for us to ask. Why is stress such an epidemic in our age? I mean, why is it that here this evening all of us know what stress is? We all know what it is to be stressed. Is it just all to do with society? Is it just to do with what's going on around us? Or what is it about us that makes us so susceptible to stress? Why is it that peace and restfulness are not the norm? And where on earth can we find those things in such a stressful world? I wonder if you ever taken time to ask those questions. Well, a period of stress can be a wake-up call to us, a call to examine ourselves and examine our lives, as we've seen. Whenever you think about it, ultimately all of those strategies that we looked at there for managing stress, all of those ways of coping with the demands, all of those ways of increasing our ability to cope, they're all ways of trying to find relief, aren't they? They're ways of trying to find relief from the various symptoms. They're a search for rest. And although they can help, and they can help for a time, they never really give us an ultimate answer. The answer ultimately to stress is never found in medication or alcohol or breaks or holidays or anything else really that we can do for ourselves. The search for rest is not ultimately found in us. The question is, where on earth can we find rest in such a stressful age? The answer is found in a person, in a very modest and unassuming man The kind of man in whose presence you could relax. Approachable, down to earth, a restful man. He had the answer. Let me read you something that he said. He said, "Come to me, all you who labour and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Well, of course, the man's name was Jesus. And as soon as he had said those words, there's one picture that would have jumped straight into the minds of his hearers. And it's the picture of cows. Believe it or not, cows. Big cows. Big oxen coupled together with a yoke. Now, this yoke was a heavy wooden bar that attached the two animals together so that they could work effectively. And to those people that were listening to Jesus, it was a picture to them. It was a picture to them of their lives. It was a picture of the daily grind, the toil, the labour, the pressure, the strain, the weight, the sweat, tiredness, the exhaustion. It was a picture of their lives. It was also to them a picture of their hearts before God, labouring to be right with Him, and yet weighed down with all of the wrong and the guilt that they had before Him. And what does He say to these people? He says, "I will give you rest." Now here are people that are weary and are burdened, and Jesus offers them relief. Exactly what they need. Someone to come along and give them rest. And in fact, the picture that he gives them is of another animal kind of coming alongside, coming underneath this yoke that's weighing them down and lifting it up, so that the animal that's weary and under pressure is allowed to stop and rest and recover and collect its strength again. And this is what Jesus does for us. He says, "I will give you rest." It's not saying that becoming a Christian means you'll never face stress. That's not what we're saying. In fact, you might even face more. But when we come to Jesus, He gives us His yoke, which He says is easy, and His burden which is light. He lifts away the burden of our guilt. He relieves the pressures of our sins so that we can face the strains and the stresses of this life, knowing a rest and a relief in the midst of them that this world can never, ever give us. Thanks very much.